Good morning, good afternoon to our European guests. On behalf of the Petro Jacyk program for the study of Ukraine at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Toronto, I welcome you to this morning's or this afternoon's webinar on preserving Gareth Jones' archive at the University of Toronto. My name is Ksenya Kiebuzinski, and I'm co-director of the program, as well as head of the Petro Jacyk Central and East European Resource Center and Slavic Resources Coordinator for the University of Toronto Libraries. This morning's event marks the formal deposit of digital preservation files of the Gareth Jones archives from the National Library and Archives of Wales to the University of Toronto Library. This collection represents a unique and important source of information about the interwar Central Eastern Europe and the Great Famine of 1932-1933 in Soviet Ukraine, known as the Holodomor. The preservation of the historical record owes great thanks to the generosity of the Temerty Foundation, the Ukrainian National Women's League of America, Russ and Karen Shelak of the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Foundation, the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, as well as other patrons. Today's program involves 3 speakers who will speak to the importance of Gareth Jones in documenting and reporting on the evidence of the Soviet famine of 1932-1933, his fate, the significance of his archival record, and how these files kind of fit in with the University of Toronto Library's special and research collections. Our first speaker is Dr. Lubomyr Luciuk, Professor of Political Geography, a Fellow of the Chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto, and a member of the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the Royal Military College of Canada. He has been recognized nationally and internationally for his educational research and advocacy efforts on behalf of the Ukrainian Canadian community. He has published books on Canada's national internment operations during World War I, on Ukrainian displaced persons, and on the Holodomor, among other topics. Dr. Luciuk, please tell us a bit about Gareth Jones and why it's so important to preserve his papers here at the University of Toronto.
Thank you. Yes, I think what we need to first start off with is the recollection that 87 years ago this August, Gareth Jones was murdered. So the promising life of a Welsh journalist was cut short literally on the eve of his 30th birthday, reportedly by Chinese bandits, but also, I think the evidence is fairly clear, as a result of the Soviet NKVD wanting to eliminate him. This was particularly tragic from the point of view of the Ukrainian diaspora, because Jones was an eyewitness from 5th to the 10th of March 1933 to the Great Famine of 1933 in Soviet Ukraine, namely the Holodomor that you've already mentioned. We now know, of course, that millions of Ukrainians perished, and that this was one of the greatest genocides to befall the 20th century in European history, even if it is still not as well known as it should be. For being a truth teller, for being a genuine reporter of the sort of reporter kind that we need in the world today, Jones not only paid what I would call the ultimate sacrifice, but even in his own life while he was still alive, he faced a great deal of public opprobrium because of the mendaciousness of Walter Duranty, the reporter from the New York Times, who dismissed Gareth Jones' accounts as being fictitious. So today, as we mark the transfer of the Gareth Jones papers to the University of Toronto for preservation, I think we need to recall that history. Now, we have recognized Jones before. In May of 2006, we recognized him with the world's first, at that time, and only trilingual English, Welsh, Ukrainian plaque at the University of Aberystwyth. But at the time, I recall thinking that that was not enough. And I spoke to the late Dr. Margaret Ciriel-Colley and the late Nigel Leeson-Colley, family members, and said, look, we have to do something more to preserve all of the Gareth Jones diaries and papers. But it turned out it was not until 2015 that we actually managed to publish the 1933 diary. So it took us almost a decade before we could get Tell Them We Are Starving, published. And of course, there we owe a great deal of thanks to Dr. Ray Gamache, who is the biographer of Gareth Jones. But even then, I still felt it was not enough, that there was a great collection of material about interwar Eastern Europe, the papers of Gareth Jones, that as a whole needed to be protected. So as you already mentioned, Ksenya, thanks to the generosity of the Timur Foundation, the Civil Liberties Foundation, the Ukrainian National Women's League of the United States, Russian Karen Chelak and REC, and working closely with Rob Phillips and Nia Dafford at the National Library and Archives of Wales, we decided to put the emphasis on making sure that all of the Gareth Jones papers were digitized and that preservation copies would then be placed in major libraries and repositories around the world. Of course, today we're doing it here at Toronto. You've mentioned that I'm a fellow of the Chair of Ukrainian Studies. We have the CIUS, we have the Petro Jacyk Center and East European Resource Center. We have CERES, we have Ksenya, we have Laurel McDonald with us. We have a collection of scholars and librarians who are interested in preserving this record. We're also doing it, I should mention, at Stanford University. We're doing it at Cambridge University, which is Gareth Jones' alma mater. We have a link to the collection through the Library of Congress in Washington. And we had hoped, of course, to do something similar at the National Library of Ukraine. And here I have to pay particular thanks and recognition to the support we got from the Timur Foundation, REC, and Mick Antoniou, the Labour MP in the Welsh Senate, or Parliament, the Senate. So with that assistance, I'm pleased to be able to say to the viewers today and the listeners that we are unveiling some additional plaques honoring Gareth Jones. The first will go into his hometown of Bury in Wales on the 12th of May. That'll follow a ceremony that's being organized in the Welsh Parliament. Excerpts from the diaries will actually be read out. And we had hoped almost immediately thereafter to, of course, do something at the National Library of Ukraine, the Vernadsky Library in Kiev. But this has, of course, now been postponed by the Russian invasion and war against Ukraine and Ukrainians. So when I thought about what I would say and how I would conclude my preliminary remarks today, I thought, well, I reached out to another great writer, of course, and that was Winston Churchill, who, when he was describing his experiences as a journalist and as a soldier eventually in South Africa in 1897, he wrote about how amid the din and dust, little but destruction can be discerned. And I thought to myself, here's Gareth Jones, a young man, his life cut short. Then comes the war. Now there's a war. Everyone's focused in on the destruction and the refugees and the war crimes and so on. But in fact, when you think about it, and Churchill did observe this, if you keep going in his paragraph, he says, a careful observer of the din and dust of battle will nevertheless be able to detect incidents of courage, of resilience, of endurance, acts of bravery, and things worthy of memory. And so even today, as Ukraine is embroiled in the din and dust of battle, and for many of us, as I say, there's little but destruction to be seen, I think there's something else out there, and that is the truth. There is what must be told about what is happening now, what must be preserved, but not only about what is happening now in 2022. We need to remember what happened in Ukraine 89 years ago when Gareth Jones, in the spring, it was March of 33, wandered around in the countryside for a few days before he was captured, saw things that he could have never anticipated, that he could scarcely have imagined, much less bring himself to describe in full detail. So here we are, April 2022. It's the month when traditionally around the world we mark International Genocide Prevention and Awareness Month. And we are remembering Gareth Jones. We're remembering a life that was cut short foully. None of us can repair that. And yet together, we can make sure, and we have made sure, that his words and his deeds, and that the story of his brave, even if somewhat tragically foreshortened life, will actually endure. So I thank you all, because together, working together over many years with the support of the patrons that we've already mentioned, we have made certain that Gareth Jones's mission has been fulfilled. The truth will prevail, and those who sought to silence Gareth Jones have clearly now failed. So from myself, I thank you all for your contributions to what I believe is a just cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Luciuk. We're now going to turn and invite Mr. Rob Phillips, Archivist of the Welsh Political Archive at the National Library of Wales. And I'm going to ask Rob to kind of maybe fill in a bit the biography of Jones for those who are here who may not kind of know about him as much as our panelists, and tell us, how did the Jones papers end up at your library, and what can you highlight from the contents? So over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. So I've got some scans of interesting pieces which I think will be of interest, and I'll take you through some of the exciting parts of the archive, which is absolutely wonderful, and which I think I think it's absolutely wonderful that it's now being preserved and made available elsewhere for people to see. So I'll just bring this up now. My name is Rob Phillips. I'm the archivist responsible for the Welsh Political Archive, the National Library of Wales, and one of the greatest parts of my job is to be responsible for collections like this. The Gareth Jones papers are a remarkable archive of worldwide significance. And that's why I was delighted when back in 2018, I had a message from Philip Colley, one of Gareth's family, who said that there was a possibility of funding to digitize part of the collection. So a few discussions later with Professor Luciuk, we were able to agree a program to digitize, thanks very much to the generous funding from the Ukrainian National Women's League of America, the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Foundation, and the Ksenya Family Foundation. And so we were able to digitize a significant part of the archive. Unfortunately, not all of it. Some parts of it were problematic due to copyright, but the majority of the papers have been digitized, and certainly the most important parts, I'd say, are now available. The COVID-19 pandemic did hold us back somewhat due to the various restrictions about working from home and so on. But the first digitized files were finally made public on the National Library of Wales website in June 2000. The physical archive is 20 boxes, which is quite substantial. And out of that, we've digitized 78 files, and that includes ranges from individual small notebooks to large bundles of letters, and they include 20 files of letters, so almost all of Gareth's correspondence, including material sent while he was a student at university in Aberystwyth and Cambridge, from his assignments in all parts of the world while travelling, 49 diaries and notebooks, and they include some student notes and things that interest him, but also the diaries and notebooks he kept while he was travelling, where he made the notes that formed his articles. We drafted his articles and recorded his thoughts. We've digitized his passports, which are an interesting record of where he went, and around about 135 photographs, which mostly are from his final around the world tour. And I'll just give you some of the highlights, because there are plenty of highlights. Unfortunately, I can only sort of skim the surface of them now. But got here one of his early letters. The early letters and diaries reveal quite a lot about Gareth. There's notebooks on interesting language, for example. There's notebooks on French. There's notebooks on international subjects, the history of Russia, European affairs, even some on medieval Welsh history. And there's wonderful letters, like I said, reveal quite a lot about Gareth, including the one on the left there, which I like because it gives you an idea of what inspired Gareth to be a journalist. The last part of the bottom says that he'd consider himself a flabby little coward if he ever gave up the chance of an interesting career for the thought of safety. He says, I have no thought for a man whose acceptance or judgment of the post depends on the answer to the question, will it give me a pension? Which I thought it really sums up Gareth's kind of zest for excitement and to be in the middle of things. He says that he's come to the conclusion that the only life he can lead which is really one of use is one connected with foreign affairs and the men and women of today. And of course, Gareth made some very significant contributions in that field. After university, where he studied both in Aberystwyth, then in Cambridge, he worked for the former Prime Minister David Lloyd George, obviously another very eminent Welshman, as an advisor on foreign affairs. And during this time, he was able to make several trips abroad, including one to Ukraine and other parts of Eastern and Central Europe. And he was able to witness at first hand the effects of the Great Depression, the Treaty of Versailles, which of course redrawn the boundaries in that region. And as well as talking to sort of high-ranking government officials and so on, he talked to everyday people. He recorded his thoughts, and it's in those notes that you're able to trace the desperate situation that people felt in terms of the result of the Great Depression and the drift of people to the political extremes, both the communists and the fascists. This is a few pages from notes he took while in Upper Silesia, and you can see the notes on the left there where he's been talking to people. As a waiter explained to him it's very bad for Germans. During the elections, there was terror for the Germans. It's bad for parents to send their children to German schools. And we've got a barber later on noting Germans can be beaten. The people here are disorientated. The people from Warsaw get all the best jobs. Why shouldn't we get these jobs? On the next page, there's a note that saying that it's dangerous to speak German. Now, you can see these tensions brewing. These are obviously the tensions from the dire economic situation, but also the forming of the tensions that Hitler was able to use a few years later as justification for his early territorial claims in the region. Gareth sadly was made redundant by Lloyd George at that time, but he landed a job with a PR consultancy in New York, Ivy Lee and Associates, and that gave him the opportunity to travel once again. And he made a second trip to the Soviet Union, this time in the company of Jack Heinz of Heinz food fame. And in this visit, when he was in the Soviet Union, he managed something of a coup, which was an interview with Lenin's widow, and we've got the notes there from that interview. He describes her in quite detail there, and this note forms an article, the basis of an article in the Welsh daily newspaper, the Western Mail, which is entitled "Lenin's Widow Speaks to a Welshman," and you see Gareth's background, his cultural background comes out here because he talks about the way that Lenin's widow talks about production in the same kind of way as a Welsh minister would preach about God, which is a really wonderful sort of vivid description there of the way she came across to Gareth. He went back to the USA, was working in the USA, and there's some wonderful material there from his time in the US. He talks about being paid a great deal of money for speaking engagements. He talks about meeting terrified bank executives. And on the left, we've got a description of him seeing a hobo city in New York. He says, where not a few minutes from Wall Street, I saw a patch of land covered in bricks and stones where a building had been brought down. But suddenly I thought it looked like huts, and there were holes in the ground, people living in the holes. So this wonderful description of unemployed men living in cardboard boxes in holes dug in the ground in just a few feet from Wall Street. We've also got a letter on the right where he's gushing about the excitement, the scale of things in New York, and Gareth's delight in facts. And he's gushing there about the size of the Empire State Building. Talks about being it's 102 stories, 1,000 feet high. It's the highest building in the world, and there's that great excitement about being part of all this this amazing place, which was very different for a boy brought up in Barry. Now, on his return from the USA, Gareth did some more traveling. He went through Europe, and he in these diaries, these notes, he's witnessing the descent of Germany into Nazism. He was in Leipzig on the day that Hitler was made Chancellor, and in his diary, file 36, he's written in capital letters, Hitler is Reichskanzler. One thing you do come across in Gareth's diary is that he was a linguist. He spoke several languages, and he flips between Welsh, English, German, Russian, all sorts, sometimes in the same sentence, the diaries, depending who he's speaking to, what he's writing down, and perhaps what he's making the notes for as well. After this, he made some trips. He wanted to see what was going on in Berlin. And so he went to Berlin. And this diary, which we know as file B19, bit of typical understatement there, that it's better known as the Hitler diary. You see on the slide here. And it's one of those items, you got them in the library's collections, which when you hold it and read it, you get a bit of a shiver down your spine. It really feels like you're holding some history. and when I'm doing talks to students, sometimes they're not overly excited by what's going on, not particularly interested. I start reading this diary, I show them the diary, and suddenly the interest perks up because they can see what we've got in our hands here is an amazing account, first-hand account of such important historical event. There's not many doodlings in Gareth's diary, so the swastika on the left is quite significant here. And on the right, you see his description of his plane ride where he was in the airplane with Berlin. It says, I'm in the airplane. If this airplane would crash, the whole history of Germany would change. Hitler's a few feet away. Goebbels is behind him. Wonderful descriptions here of, that Goebbels is eating a cheese sandwich and smiling when he reads a newspaper report of a speech that he made in Hanover. So you've got these really interesting sort of descriptions, draws you in, and Gareth travels to Frankfurt where he sees the rally. He thinks Hitler's a very ordinary-looking man, doesn't quite understand how he can enthrall people so much. But later on, when he gets to the rally, he sees that every space is taken, there's flags flying, twice as high as the Eisteddfod Pavilion. He says, once again, a description that only works in a Welsh newspaper, but it gives you the description of what's going on there. Now, after this, Gareth could have gone home, he'd got the story, but instead he went to the Soviet Union. And of course, that was where the real story was at this time. And when he arrived in Moscow on March 5th, 1933, it was immediately apparent things are very bad. There's notes there about people saying there's famine in villages, comments about eggs becoming luxuries, and the people who'd fled to Moscow being terrified of being forced to return home. You see a description on the left there of an incident he's witnessed where a peasant who's with children has been begging for food is dragged away by the police. In the notes, that is quite clear that Gareth knows that, well, it's bad when he's in Moscow. It's much, much worse in Ukraine. So he decides he's going to go there, he's going to witness it. And the effects of the famine are instantly visible. On the right, one of the first descriptions is diaries of what he saw when he went to Ukraine. So, across the border, I talked to peasants, they all have the same story. There is no bread. We haven't had bread for 2 months, they're saying. They're saying, there's nothing to feed the cattle with. We used to feed the world, but now we are hungry. How can we work in the fields when we're weak? We are weak from lack of food. And once again, here's another example of Gareth switching between languages in the diary, which makes them difficult to follow, but it's a fascinating sort of note on his thought process. As well as the famine in Ukraine, he notes the Soviet campaign to stamp out any Ukrainian national sentiment. And you're seeing about halfway down the page on the left there, the new Ukraine policy in the last few weeks has been Russification, Muscovites placed in leading positions. Russian is now taught in schools and so on. And one of my favorites, probably the best quotes in this is you can see on the right there where he's at the opera and he says that there's plenty of lipstick, but no bread. And gives you the sort of Gareth's take on that that time he was in Ukraine. Another really interesting aspect of this trip is the same as when he was in the Soviet Union in 1930. Is when he wrote back to his parents. The left, there's a letter from Kharkiv where he's thinking, what a wonderful time he's having. He gushes about this wonderful train he's riding on. That it's got a sleeping car to Moscow, really wonderful. Then when he gets to Danzig on the right, he tells them the truth. He's telling them that the situation is terrible, famine everywhere, millions are dying of starvation. Tramps the village of Ukraine, there was no bread, children had swollen stomachs. He said the terrors increased. Now, this is wonderful. A few days apart, and it shows the importance of the archiving context here, because without the second letter, you'd have a totally wrong impression of what he'd seen, what he'd experienced, and how he felt. Once again, a reminder: even first-hand documentary evidence in archives can be treated with caution. But it's a really interesting, once again, take on how Gareth had to communicate. He couldn't tell the truth whilst he was in the Soviet Union because that letter would not have got there, or perhaps even worse, he might have been intercepted himself. When he got back, of course, he released the story, broke the story about the suffering. as a result, was banned from the Soviet Union, which must have been really quite difficult. Gareth had family connections with Ukraine, with his mother being a governess there before the revolution. So that must have been quite difficult for him. But he went back to work in the Western Mail. Must have been difficult. He wanted to travel. He wanted to see places, record things in a wider sphere, and he did. He went to Ireland. It's not a well-noted trip, but there's some Brit there. You can see on the top of this page, Catholic versus Protestant, the big divide in Northern Ireland. He interviews unionists and nationalist politicians, general people, ministers of religion. There's one priest who says that there can be no peace in Ireland, north or south, until partition is undone. And once again, sadly, a reflection of a situation that's sadly still with us now. He visited the Republic of Ireland, what was then the Irish Free State, met with the widow of Kevin O'Higgins, who was a member, had been a member of the Irish Parliament. She talks about De Valera, who was then the Taoiseach, saying that he had one quality, that he's an astute politician, and the most astute thing he ever did was to murder her husband, which is pretty dramatic stuff, and Gareth is recording all this. Ireland wasn't enough. He craved more adventure. He went on a trip around the world in October 1934, and in a series of 11 diaries, he records that trip, and it's absolutely wonderful, and I wish I had more time to tell you about it, but it really is fascinating where he went to the Philippines, all these places, Singapore, Cambodia. He spent a lot of time in Japan, which he really loved, and he ended up in China, sending back numerous letters with colour descriptions and some photographs, recording life in Mongolia. Wasn't as quite enamoured of China, described such the place he stayed in not quite so good terms. Talks about having to wait for roads to dry out while they got stuck. There's a photograph there showing his car being towed out of the mud. And then a typed extract from a letter, see on the top there, from July 1935. He said, I left home 9 months ago, and today I shall be home in a little over 3 months. And sadly, he never made it because he was detained by Japanese soldiers, sent on his way in a supposedly safe route, and then kidnapped by bandits and murdered the day before his 30th birthday. One thing we haven't been able to digitize, sadly, are the files of correspondence with the British government after his death, which note the strong suspicions of the British government that the Soviet authorities were involved in Gareth's murder. That was a very brief fly-through of the collection. Thanks to the generosity of Gareth's family, the archive ended up in the National Library. Gareth's niece, Margaret Cyril Colley, realised the importance of the papers. She presented them to the library, and Gareth's family have kept close contact with us since. And thanks to the generosity of the sponsors to digitisation, the archive is now not just available in Aberystwyth, but worldwide. And that's a really wonderful thing. And I think, given that Gareth was so enthused by knowledge, information, and truth being out there for all to see, I think that he'd be absolutely delighted by this.
Thank you, Rob, for such a vivid description of the documents. And it's mind-boggling to think that we can all read them. It's not, you don't have to get on a flight and a train to Cardiff to go look at them. And it is kind of chilling. I started my career as an archivist, and the actual seeing the material in this way is amazing. Before I turn over to Loryl, I just want to let the participants who are here know that they can ask questions through the Q&A. So you might be thinking about what you would like to ask our previous two speakers as I introduce our next one, Ms. Laurel McDonald, who is presently Associate Chief Librarian for Special Collections and Director of the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library at the University of Toronto. And I'd like to say that prior to these positions, Laurel was the University Archivist at the University of Toronto Archives and Records Management Services for 20 years. And in that role, she had positions as president of the Association of Canadian Archivists, the Archives Association of Ontario, and the Toronto Area Archivists Group. So you're speaking to committed archivists here. Laurel will be accepting on behalf of the University of Toronto Libraries the digital files to share, and she will share with us how this material fits in with our collections. Laurel, please.
Thank you so much, Ksenia. And as an archivist, this archives is very close to my heart. And I have to admit, I have a lot of questions for Rob and Lubomyr about this. But on behalf of the University of Toronto Libraries, I'm very pleased to accept the deposit of the Gareth Jones digital archives. And this is it here. And it's hard to believe that it's 73 files of incredibly rich primary sources. So as Rob so passionately pointed out, the notebooks, the diaries, and the correspondence that Jones created during the 1930s are an incredibly remarkable documentary heritage, an incredibly remarkable testimony on the Holodomor and on Ukraine during the interwar period. So it's a great honor and a great pleasure to help preserve these materials for subsequent generations. I'm pleased to report that the digital files have already been uploaded to the University of Toronto's digital repository, and we will certainly offer online access to the materials as well via the website of the National Library and Archives of Wales. So these digital archives will be joining the U of T Library's other remarkable Ukrainian holdings. These include our very vast archival collections, for example, such as the Peter Petichny Insurgency and Counterinsurgency Archives, as well as the John Luciuk Displaced Person Collection as well, which I understand is one of the largest archives of its kind in the world. And these rich Ukrainian holdings also comprise rare book collections. For example, we have the Ukrainian Millennial Old Book Collection that includes an 18th century gospel that was actually held by St. Michael's Golden Dome Monastery in Kiev. So this archive will be part of a larger remarkable UTL holdings as well. And I know how difficult, as an archivist, I know how difficult it can be to digitize archival collections. So I wish to thank the Ukrainian National Women's League of America, the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Foundation, the Temerity Foundation, as well as many other patrons who made this digitization possible. We're also very grateful to Lubomyr and to Rob for working in cooperation to make sure that this archives is made discoverable and accessible, not only to people in Wales, but to people around the world. And also I'm very grateful to my U of T library colleagues as well, Ksenya, as well as Steve Marks, who's the head of the Digital Preservation Unit here in the U of T Libraries. Again, we're so grateful for this opportunity to play this role in preserving and sharing Ukraine's history for subsequent generations. So thank you so much.
So we have one question that's come in through the Q&A, and Laurel, you can always unmute yourself and ask your questions. But let me first take the one from the audience, from Sophia Isayev, who Rob is asking, how did Gareth travel to Moscow in March 1933?
I think he travelled partly by train, mostly by train. Although there's talk about flying in there. I know he flew partway back because there's a note in his diary about being in a terrible storm, and the flight was quite frightening. So Gareth wasn't one to be scared of new technology. He did fly. But given the notes that I've seen there about the wonderful sleeping car that he was in and so on, the fact that a lot of his letters are posted from railway stations, I imagine that probably most of the travel was by train. Certainly the initial travel from Moscow into Ukraine in 1933 was by train. And that's where he sort of went off grid for a few days. But yeah, so that's my understanding, certainly.
I have a question before I let Laurel ask hers, but about the photograph. Well, we saw one. I don't know how many photographs there are, but was he the photographer? Or did he have a photographer who traveled with him?
He took the pictures, a lot of the pictures himself. That's one of the reasons we're able to include them, is because we're fairly confident about the copyright of those pictures. He did have companions traveling with him, but those photographs were from Gareth's camera, so we're fairly confident that he took them. There are other photographs from earlier in his career, but sadly we weren't able to ascertain the copyright with enough certainty to be able to digitize, because as he worked for some quite well-known newspapers, they're very, very cautious about use of copyright, and we had to be very careful with that, sadly. But there are other photographs, but the vast majority that we have are from that round the world trip.
Professor Luciuk, perhaps you could tell us a bit about what's next, in terms of whether Gareth Jones or documenting the Holodomor, and the question of investigating his death. I imagine now circumstances are even more difficult than they could have been. So if you could perhaps tell us a bit more.
Well, I think the immediate next stages are to unveil the trilingual plaque at Bury, where Gareth Jones was born and where he's buried. So in fact, that will happen on the 12th of May. We would have been proceeding with another event in Kiev, but that's obviously been postponed by the war. That will happen hopefully as soon as the war is ended and conditions allow. So those are the immediate next steps. I did take note, and Rob and I have discussed this before, that there are Foreign Office records that speak to the circumstances under which Gareth Jones met his end. And although those are owned, as it were, by the British government, researchers like myself can actually go to the Foreign Office, see these documents, and publish them. We've done that with the records of the Foreign Office on the famine. So perhaps one way of making those documents available to sort of add information about the end of Gareth Jones' life would be to publish them separately with, of course, the permission of the National Library and Archives of England, or the National Archives of England, of the UK. So that might be another step. In terms of the Holodomor itself, of course, we're coming up to the 90th anniversary. Now, the events in Ukraine have obviously made it difficult to do that, any kind of commemoration, but I think there is a great need now to make a concerted effort to have the world recognize the Holodomor as an act of genocide. As much as we'd like to believe otherwise, very few countries in the world have officially recognized the Holodomor as genocide. The United Kingdom hasn't, France hasn't, the United States hasn't, Australia hasn't, Germany hasn't, Italy hasn't, so on and so forth. You can't expect the Russian Federation to, of course, but some of these other West European countries that are now very much aware of what Ukraine is and what Ukrainians are experiencing, I think now is the time to re-emphasize the need to recognize the genocidal nature of the Holodomor. So I think the great next push will be on that front.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions that have come in the Q&A. One is, well, I'm going to bundle them for you, Rob. They're both directed to you, I think. In terms of documenting the Holodomor in the Gareth Jones archive, are his diaries or his articles the richest source for that? And in relation to that, if you could just remind our participants the percentage of what has been digitized, and whether there are any photographs that were taken in Soviet Ukraine in that time period.
Right. Well, in terms of where the richest descriptions are, I would definitely say the diaries and letters are, because they're immediate, but they are notes, so they're much more difficult to follow. But they're immediate. They were written while Gareth was there, while things were still fresh in his mind. Obviously, what went into his articles was distilled, was sort of put together after the time, and obviously edited for space as well. But there are certain things in the articles. There are differences between the notes in the diaries and the articles. Sometimes where Gareth has perhaps rethought about something and thought that something was more significant or less significant. So there are some differences. So it's worth looking at both. But I'd certainly say that the diaries and the letters offer a different insight. And to me, I find them, like I said, a richer sort of description, because they were done at the time. Although, like I said, they can be quite difficult to follow on occasion, but definitely worth the effort. In terms of the materials being digitized, we worked with, obviously with these things as compromises, we'd love to digitize more. Some parts of the archive were not digitized because of copyright concerns, so they include some of the photographs and also some of the articles, because quite a number of files in the archive are newspaper cuttings or copies of articles, and we didn't digitize those because the copyright situation on those could be really difficult, and in many cases it was difficult to work out who the copyright owner was, and the newspapers can be quite, should we say, guarded about permission to digitize that kind of material. So the main reason material wasn't digitized was because of problems with copyright. But obviously, there's obviously a limit to what you can do in terms of the funding that's available as well. So what we did is we worked with Lubomyr, and we looked at what the most important files were. I'd say probably in terms of bulk, we're probably about 65% digitized. But the material that isn't digitized, a great deal of it will be material that is either copies of articles, that kind of material, which are already in the public domain in that sense. Photographs, there are photographs from a number of different periods. There's some material photographs, so obviously the photographs that were taken during the round the world trip in Mongolia. There's other material that's family related. For example, there's material around Gareth's sister, I believe, Arian, who was worked near where I live on a farm during the First World War. There's photographs of those. There's photographs from the United States. There's, say, family photographs, a lot of postcards which he bought on his journeys. Negatives, but once again, there are concerns about the copyright with those, sadly. But the ones we were able to digitize, we've done all those. But there are more pictures here if anyone does fancy a trip over to Wales to see them.
But none from his time in Soviet Ukraine.
I believe there are,
Okay.
but I don't believe there are that many. But I can check that.
Oh, we can check it. Well, what's digitized?
From what's this, they won't be with the digitized files, but we've got. I'm just going through what's here now. These are mostly. There's a few.
I think if the question is whether there are photographs of famine victims, the answer is no.
No.
Okay. All right. Laurel, would you want to go ahead and unmute yourself? And yeah.
I just have two really quick questions. One is, Rob, have you thought about transcribing the materials as well now?
Yes, we have looked at that. Oksana from the Ukrainian National Women's League of America has been in touch with me about that. We've looked at a few possibilities. There are complications because of the nature of the language used and so on. But we are looking to see what we can do in that sense, because it would make the diaries, certainly make the diaries much more user-friendly if you could free text search them, for example, or even just read them typed, because his writing can be difficult to follow sometimes. He does write sideways, upside down, all over the place. So that easy to follow, and also in terms of the language as well, there may be a case that we can use translation. Now, some work has been done there and already been published, so we would like to look at that. It's certainly something I'd like to do, because it would make the collection a lot more user friendly. But obviously resources and people to do it is the other thing as well.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. It would be a wonderful, it would be such a useful tool though, I'm sure. And I do have actually a question actually as well, and I guess for Lubomyr, and that is how is Gareth Jones perceived in Ukraine? Does he have a presence? Are Ukrainians aware of his work?
Yes, I think they are. And when we approached the National Library of Ukraine, the Vernadsky Library, they were quite excited about the opportunity to get a preservation copy. They were quite excited about the idea of having a plaque honoring Gareth Jones that was already confirmed that it would be in the library itself. And then, of course, Mr. Putin decided to derail the project. So we've postponed that for obvious safety reasons. But the awareness of Gareth Jones as being one of a very few journalists and reporters who told the truth at the time and who witnessed it and whose evidence as such is therefore very difficult to contradict, because of course someone writing about it decades later and giving an interpretation, well, that can be challenged. But here is an eyewitness account by a very credible individual who spoke Russian, traveled in the region, and came out immediately and told the truth as soon as he left Soviet territory. So the evidence chain there, as we might call it, is very strong. So I think Ukrainians are aware of Gareth Jones, increasingly so. There is talk about issuing the 33 diary in Ukrainian. Of course, that's been interrupted as well. And Rob and I had plans actually in May to visit the same region that Gareth Jones was in when he recorded The Famine. But again, it's currently being visited by other people. So we'll go there when we can.
Okay, I see another question come in. Gareth was awarded the Ukrainian Order of Freedom at Westminster Hall, London in November 2000. Oh, this is a comment. In November 2008, received by his niece, Margaret Serial Colley. Okay.
And we have to point out that the Colley family has been just remarkably generous and supportive of these various efforts. They have their own website. Nigel, Lisa and Colley had a website dedicated to Gareth Jones. It's still available. So there's material that the Colley family has published that will fill in some of the gaps that Rob was mentioning, because there they reproduced his articles and things. And those books are available, I think, at the University of Toronto and in libraries around the world. So although there is a gap in the digitized collection, I think, as Rob pointed out, that gap is filled by books that do exist.
I will just mention, sorry, I just mentioned one thing. I just had a message, actually. It's wonderful that some of Gareth's family are with us today on the event.
Good.
I had a message from one of them. Richard has just been in touch. And he said, as a child, he remembers seeing black and white negatives where he could discern starving children. But he thinks they were lost before the diaries were discovered. So that would explain why perhaps we don't have those in the collection. But it sounds like there originally were some photographs that may have been from Ukraine.
So we have a question coming from Dr. Frank Sisson on, is there any current discussion with the New York Times to discuss Duranty's attacks on Gareth Jones and the possible retraction of the Pulitzer Prize?
There was a campaign that was launched in 2003, 2004, just around the time of the Orange Revolution, by the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association and in conjunction with Friends in the United States, to have the Pulitzer Prize of Walter Duranty rescinded or revoked. That achieved something in the sense that there was a great deal of media attention to it. So now that anyone studying or looking at the record of Walter Duranty would know that he was mendacious, that he lied about the famine and so on. But in the end, the Pulitzer Prize Committee declined to revoke the award for various reasons, none of them particularly compelling, but that was their decision. I think efforts to have the Pulitzer Prize revoked now would be futile. I know that there are some people still trying it, but I think we need to move on and go on to other projects related to the Holodomor. The New York Times is not going to entertain a discussion with the diaspora about the Pulitzer Prize. They'll refer, and they already have, to the Pulitzer Prize Committee's decision, so it just becomes a circle. So, you know, you can spend time doing that, and I understand the emotional need to do it, but I think that's a futile effort. A far more important one is to get Western governments, particularly now, to recognize the Holodomor was genocidal, and to get away from slogans like, you know, Ukraine remembers, the world acknowledges, all that kind of stuff. I forget if that's the exact right one, but this gives many people the feeling that somehow major countries have recognized the Holodomor as a genocide, and that's simply not true. Canada has. Canada's an important country, but the United States hasn't. So you can talk about the Senate, or you can talk about the House of Representatives, you can talk about this or that, province or state, but that's not the same thing. So when I look at the world and I say, the Vatican has not recognized the Holodomor as genocide, France hasn't, Italy hasn't, the United Kingdom hasn't. When I see that, Israel hasn't. So we need to refocus our attentions on things that we can achieve. And hopefully by the 90th anniversary, particularly given the brutality of the Russian war against Ukrainians and the Ukrainian state, this may be the opportunity. The Pulitzer Prize is a dead end.
Thank you, Lubomyr. I'm going to ask one more question and see if there's any more, and we'll maybe start wrapping it up. But I'm wondering about Gareth Jones corresponding to others during his time when he was reporting, and what might be in letters that are in other archives, and have there been an exploration of pursuing that?
That's
Not that I'm
interesting.
aware of.
Yeah. I think Reagamash may perhaps be the person who may be able to answer that more than I can. Gareth is certainly very well connected, but yes, I'm not really sure.
Well, maybe that's something we explore, because we always think of archives. I mean, that's what's incoming, right?
Yeah.
And you keep, unless, you know, you did carbon copies or photocopy, but given the time he was writing, it would have been handwritten, likely letters.
Yes, a lot of the correspondence, of course, is to his family, you see, which is why it's remained within the archive. It's back to his parents, and that's really rich. We've got a great deal of his outgoing correspondence, very little of his incoming correspondence in that sense. But certainly, if anyone is aware of connections, we'd be really delighted to hear about them.
Yeah, because I would think he would have been corresponding with fellow journalists. There were a lot of people traveling to the Soviet Union in that time period. So, so anyways, something to explore. I see one of our participants says that she has not a question but a comment, but she has not placed the comment in the Q&A, so I don't know what the comment may be. So Oksana Luciuk, if you want to comment, please type your comment in the Q&A. But otherwise, I really am grateful to Lubomyr Luciuk for considering the University of Toronto and deciding on giving us, entrusting us with Gareth Jones' legacy. Rob Phillips for the work that you do at the archive, and your vast knowledge of Gareth Jones and where he fits in the political history, and your enthusiasm is infectious, and I'm so glad that you're speaking with students who are learning from you, and Laurel for supporting the deposit of this archive at the University of Toronto Library. And I am looking forward to when we have linked to the website of the National Library of Wales with all the files, so that it'll be easily discoverable on our University of Toronto platform. Okay, I see We have, so I don't know, I was thanking, but now I see there's a couple of comments. I feel that I, as chair, should acknowledge the comments before we close off. Oksana Luciuk, thank you for this wonderful presentation. Grateful to the U of T for uploading the diary so quickly, and looking forward to the event in Cardiff, which is on May 12th. So you may want to plug the event before we close, and anxiously awaiting the possibility of transcribing the archives. And I was thinking that was such a good question, Laurel. And I know there's a crowdsourcing is people with linguistic skills, they're out there. I transcribe records for the Arlson archives documenting Nazi crimes against Jews and Slavs and Roma, and it's a very gratifying work. I volunteer. Every name counts. It's the project, and I read documents that are very difficult to read, but I feel like I'm making some kind of contribution. So you might want to consider some, I mean, granted, you'd want a secure platform where nothing would happen, but that's a possibility. Thank you to all our participants, and thank you for those of you who attended today's session, and we'll close off there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ksenia.
Thank you.
Thank you.